Hello, listening squirrels. Having trouble with my lights and everything, so I got my little light over here. Anyway, this might be kind of dangerous because I have not read this ahead of time. I just look for haunted or Halloween stories. Just Googled it in public domain. So we're going to read The Phantom Coach today, or part of it, as much as I can read. Amelia B. Edwards wrote it, and here's a little bit about her. Amelia B. Edwards was born in London, England. Love London. Been twice. Love it, love it, love it. In 1831, she was homeschooled by her mother and began writing at a very young age. Her first poem was published when she was 17 years old, and first story was published 5 years later. She went on to write for magazines and newspapers, and in 1855 she published her first novel. And being a woman during those times was probably kind of hard to get things published, I'm thinking. Apart from being an accomplished writer, Amelia B. Edwards was also an avid traveler and Egyptologist. She died of influenza on April 15, 1892. And about the Phantom Coach. It says the Phantom Coach was first published in 1864 in a Christmas edition of the weekly literary magazine. All the Year Round was the name of the magazine. Edited by Charles Dickens. It's the story of a young barrister who gets lost on the English moors. It's a snowy winter's night, and he begs the hospitality of a reclusive scientist. The scientist does his best for the young man and then directs him to a spot where he should be able to meet up with the coach carrying the night mail. Unfortunately, a phantom coach haunts the same stretch of road and the barrister boards the wrong vehicle. The Phantom Coach is one of Amelia B. Edwards' most successful stories, and to this day it's often included in ghost story anthologies. So here we go, The Phantom Coach. The circumstances I'm about to relate to you have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years, I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season, I had been out all day with my gun and had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December, the place a bleak wide moor in the far north of England, and I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand and sailed anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills some 10 or 12 miles apart. Not the faintest smoke wreath, nor the tiniest cultivated patch, or fence, or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on and take my chance of finding what shelter I could by the way. So I shouldered my gun again and pushed wearily forward, for I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlor, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We had been married 4 months, and having spent our autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love, and of course very happy. This morning when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What I would, what I, what I not, what I would have not given to have kept my word. Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time the snow fell and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shout seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on and on in the falling snow until wearied out they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus enough all this long dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way? When I too must sleep the sleep of death? Death, I shuddered. How hard to die just now when my life lay so bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart but that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered, or did I only fancy that I heard a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear I should be lost in the snow. Aye, then, folks do get cast away hereabouts from time to time, and that's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded." "If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, friend, we must submit," I replied, "but I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I from Dwolding?" "A guide 20 mile, more or less. No, a good," sounds like a Scottish accent, "a good 20 mile, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "The nearest village is Wyke, and that's 12 mile t'other side." "Where do you live, then?" "Out yonder," said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. "You're going home, I presume?" "Maybe I am." "Then I'm going with you." The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. "It ain't o' no use," growled he. He won't let you in, not he." "We'll see about that," I replied briskly. "Who is he?" "The master." "Who is the master?" "That's nowt to you," was the unceremonious reply. Well, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and a supper tonight." "Hey, you can try him," muttered the reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled gnome-like away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking feroci- furiously. "Is this the house?" I asked. "Aye, it's the house. Down, bay!" And he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute he had turned the key and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked round with curiosity and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served apparently a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the center of the floor stood some huge object, gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw to my surprise a telescope of this considerably size, of very considerable size, mounted on a rude movable platform with four small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal, rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument and asking myself whether it was not in the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said my guide with a malicious grin. "Yonder's his room." He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from a table covered with books and papers and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" he said, "and how came you here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law, on foot across the moor, meat, drink, and sleep." He bent his bushy brow into a portentous frown. "Mine is not a house of entertainment," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dared you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the oldest man. He followed me over the muir and shouldered his way in before me. "I'm no match for 6'2". "And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning, the right of self-preservation." "Self-preservation? There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied briefly, "and it should be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak." He strode to the window, pulled away a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay if you choose till morning. Jacob, serve the supper." With this he waved me to a seat, returned his own, and he began at once, absorbed in the studies from which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangement than the hall, this room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless, The whitewashed walls were in parts scratched over with strange diagrams, and others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. Oh, let's see. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios. On the other, a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the hall appeared the half-open door of a cupboard at the further end of the room. I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantel shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all and learned, not lean, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I'll read just a little bit more. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen, yet seemed it stranger still to find such a room in a low farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again I looked from my host into his surroundings, from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than of a philosopher, broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair. It had all the ideality of much of the ruggedness that characteristics the head of Louis van Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth and the same stern furrows in his brow. I'm sorry, y'all. I am tripping it's kind of hard to read on this phone. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose, and with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. "I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies of our larder." I had already fallen upon the viands, and now protested, with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman, that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly and sat down then to supper, which consisted primitively of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when we had done, Jacob removed the tray, and I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, said, "Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time, I have not seen so many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You're the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so long? Pray interrogate me, I replied. I am heartily at your service. He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward on his elbows, resting on the knees, and his chin supported in the palm of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. And I think I might have to stop there, y'all. Sleepiness is overtaking me. It's not a whole bunch more. I should probably get the rest of it read in one more reading. Come on, come on. Come on, I'm trying to mark you. Goodness gracious. Oh well, I'll do that after I get off. Live at 3 today. Tea at 3. Tea at 3 with GrannyDee, and it's StreamYard Saturday. So I'll be picking 2 or 3. Last time we only had time for 2. And I don't know that I'll ask the same fall questions I asked the other folks. Could be anything, whatever. But hope to see you at 3. Bring your tea and your whip or whatever you want, and I'll see you then. Be sweet. Don't be ugly. Bye-bye.